What is colorism?
Colorism is the social environment in which people make judgments about other people based on their skin color. So colorism includes racism. And I think the only reason we had to formulate the term colorism is that if people of color do the same thing that white people do, you can't call it racism. So they call it colorism. A person's skin tone becomes a signal of some kind in your assessment of who that person is, and etc. Colorism is racism.
How does colorism affect the world we live in?
Colorism has had a huge impact because we all have suffered from Europe's concoction of racism and the notion that skin color was somehow related to different kinds of biology. Of course, we know now that all human beings are the same. There's no such thing as races. But for purposes of domination, that idea continues to exist despite the science proving the contrary. So there's been the last several hundred years of human civilization has been dominated by the West, and they have instituted ideas about whiteness. Because Europe dominates, or has until in recent centuries, dominated the global economy, the global social organization, dominated education. The idea of whiteness, and then those people who are not white, has become part of the daily diet of people in all parts of the world.
Do you think colorism plays a role in the ways news is depicted in media?
Yes, obviously. I mean, the history is replete with examples of how the media promotes certain kinds of news, certain kinds of images if it relates to people of color, and maybe not so much if it's a white person. I have to say, though, I think that the media is much, certainly the American media, is much better now than it was, I don't know, before.
Yeah.
I think they are aware of this problem and have taken conscious and successful steps to rectify it. The colorism is the bedrock of European-oriented culture at the moment. So media operates within the culture in which it exists. Color is linked to other kinds of ideas and images and impressions and assumptions and this, that, and the other. In other countries where those associations don't exist, then colorism is not that much a factor. The problem of colorism in the media has long been recognized. It's long been recognized as a problem. But in recent years and decades, increasing, I think, with the Black Lives Matter movement, media outlets are deliberately trying to get away from the old habits, which involve certain kinds of colorism.
Do you think that the media accurately represents the entire population?
Generally speaking, the answer is no.
Well, no, absolutely not.
I don't think so. I think maybe it's gotten a bit better in recent years as, America has become more diverse, and media is trying to cater to different audiences. And to do that, accurate representations help. But I think stereotypes, racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, all types of stereotypes are still often perpetuated in the media in different ways. And I think, that affects people's perceptions of different groups.
People in minoritized or racialized communities always feel that they are underrepresented, or if they are represented at all, they are represented in very limited ways. That is to say, it caters to a certain market expectation and market expectations of a majority white community and television consumers and watchers. So they play on these sort of traditional tropes that are embedded in American history as to how they perceive people of color, whether they are Asian American, whether they're African American, Afro descent peoples, generally speaking, and also Latinx folks. Again, each of those categories say nothing, ultimately. Those are just racial census categories. It does not necessarily represent the diversity within those categories themselves, whether it's regional, whether it's ethnic, whether it's linguistic, whether it's class, whether it's gender. All those things become intersections, and we want to see ourselves in all our complexity, right? Bad or good, or in between, or both. But yet, of course, white characters get to be complicated characters, that somehow they are individual, so that their character development is from the inside, like they have struggles inside, whereas I would always see the racialized character as not having those struggles, but somehow their choices come from the outside. There are exceptions to this. There are ways by which many producers, cultural producers, including directors and writers of color and actors of color, who really try to complicate this and individuate, their characters despite the limitations posed on those characters.
I think that the media, that's obviously a very broad term, but the media, mainstream media, corporate media, tends to look at the world in terms of the perspective of white people, particularly white men with resources. And it's because those are the folks who are calling the shots, the people who are the gatekeepers, who are framing the images that we see on a regular basis. They're going to do it from their perspective. They're not going to do it from the perspective of those who are marginalized, so-called minority groups, those who don't have power, and those whose voices have basically remained silent because they don't have the resources to project their images.
Yeah, I do a lot with racial stereotypes. I mean, I've done, I did my PhD, even before I went to law school, and it focused on racial stereotypes. I think stereotypes come a lot into play into affirmative action debate, and particularly with the Harvard case, where the plaintiffs are Asian American. And I think, think about different racial stereotypes around, say, academic achievement and other areas. Asian Americans are, say, diametrically opposed to African Americans, to Latina, individuals. You look at the stereotypes of Asian Americans. You have the model minority, that they are high achievers, do really well in school because of the cultural work ethic they have. And that kind of, obscures some other issues. The fact that a lot of Asian Americans who may fit into this quote unquote model minority category are children of educated immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1965 gave preference to educated, scientifically trained professionals. That was the middle of the Cold War. So we needed more scientists and engineers in this country, and Korea, China, India had more of those scientists and engineers. So, out of that, by the time the children of those immigrants, some of the immigrants themselves, were going to elite colleges and universities, 1980s, affirmative action debate was also kind of heating up at that time. But you have the stereotype of Asian Americans as the model minority, which is used to pit Asian Americans against African Americans and other groups, and it ignores the very different histories of these groups.
Do you think there's any truth rooted in that term?
Let me also add to what I said before, that this whole model minority idea really applies to the extent that, the high achievement is there. It's a very specific segment of the Asian American population. It's that kind of a 1965 Immigration Act. And later on, there were family preferences and other things. But there are plenty of Asian Americans who do not fit into that framework, who are underrepresented at different universities, who are not high achievers, who struggle in many ways. Another kind of insidious part of the model minority is that it masks a lot of the different struggles that different Asian Americans face. Now, as far as thinking of the accuracy of the stereotype, it's true that you see an overrepresentation, a large representation of Asian Americans at elite universities and elite educational spaces. Sometimes, strikingly so. The Asian American population has become pretty prominent at places like Harvard. It's 25% or so, and Asian Americans, the general population, are 4%. But that 25% is, again, a very specific segment of Asian Americans. And I think we have to remember, as I said, these are largely children of educated immigrants, not exclusively. But immigrant, you think about immigrants in general, that's not a randomly selected population or a randomly selected sample of people in China or India or Korea. China has over 1 billion people. I think India does now too. And that's a very select population that's coming from there. So think about if you took, say, all African Americans who went to Ivy League schools or went to Harvard and Yale and sent them to some place where there's very few Black people. I don't know, Ukraine or something like that. They would be the model minority, right? People would say, all these high achieving Black folks, they're the high achievers. And that's similar to what's happened with Asian Americans. You have the most educated people from these Asian countries coming over here, and we see them as the model minority. So, to get to your point, in that sense, there's some quote unquote truth to it. But we have to remember, we're talking about a very select population here. There are other factors also. Some of the countries that these immigrants are coming from, they have a tradition of high stakes exams, standardized testing. So there are other factors. There are a number of different factors there, different cultural factors that play into it somewhat. But a large part of it is structural. It is the fact that you have Asian Americans are just positioned differently than, say, African Americans and Native Americans, Latino folks. African Americans, largely descendants of slaves, did not come here voluntarily. The Asian American immigrants, came here voluntarily, largely. So just a whole different positioning here, different histories.
How do you think media representation kind of feeds into this separation of minority groups?
In as much as these media representations reflect these stereotypes. And I do think, I think media has gotten somewhat better about that because just greater representation of different groups brings out different things. But I just think back, I think back even to, think of some of the commercials that were coming out back in the mid 2000s, where I don't know if you remember Yao Ming, center for the Houston Rockets, was one of the first Asian American basketball player to gain a lot of prominence. He was 7 feet 5 inches tall, was a center, was the first pick in the NBA draft. And he did a commercial for, I think, Apple, for Mac. And it's you never saw a Black player do a commercial for a computer, computer products. They do commercials for all these other things, sneakers and all that. But the Asian American doing commercial for Apple, that fits stereotypes, right? The Asian Americans are supposed to be these kind of computer geeks and know all about computers. That's part of the whole model minority and socially inept stereotype. So images like that, I think, reinforce stereotypes. And people, I talked about how the model minority is kind of diametrically opposed to stereotypes of African Americans, but people don't always see it that way. If we look at the broader picture and broader ideology that's created out of it, we see, you got this nice white ideal in the middle, and you can justify excluding African Americans and Native Americans by, opposing affirmative action. You can say that Asian Americans, they're great students, they're great at science and math, but not leadership potential. And that's part of the reason, you see, because of those stereotypes, Asian Americans are well represented in technical professions, computer science and all that, but underrepresented in leadership positions. The folks in charge are not Asian American, even though Asian Americans are such high achievers. So I think media depictions, play into that. As I said, they've changed over time, but historically, you didn't see Asian Americans in leadership positions and weren't well represented at all in media. And when they were, they were associated like with their home countries rather than as Asian Americans. They're like foreigners. And that's a common stereotype of Asian Americans also. Anti-Blackness is a worldwide phenomenon and is, one frame we can look at racism from. You can look at it from the sense of white supremacy. You can look at it really as anti-Blackness also. And of course, the two are related, but, it's all about what you center in your broader analysis. It's like, I think there's a Black, non-Black divide, in the US certainly, but all across the world, where Black people are just positioned at the bottom in different ways. And then you can also look at it as, white people on top, white supremacy, and all the rest of us are oppressed. And I think both lenses are useful. But, I think, number one, that whole color hierarchy on the South Asian subcontinent, and also in East Asia, it's still there. It's definitely there. I didn't talk about as much. That's transposed onto a broader racial framework where dark-skinned people are viewed as inferior, and that's transposed onto Black people. So, all those stereotypes over time in different shows, I think have been reinforced.
What do you think causes the misinterpretation of certain minority groups?
I don't necessarily think it's a misinterpretation, because that assumes there's a right interpretation, right? And there is not one representation or interpretation, because precisely even within the community and all the complications of a particular community, there will be different interpretations, but the range of nuance will be different. Let's say, that's what I mean. So in misinterpretation, in a sense of, let's say, a outsider perspective could be a misinterpretation. But on the other hand, there are multiple interpretations within a community of how we would see an Asian American, how we see specifically a Filipino American, a Chinese American, a South Asian American, and of course even that you have to break up. Oh, Indian American, Pakistani American, again by religion, by class. Again, even if you were to take the South Asian sort of example, then you have the folks who are living in New Jersey in this IT corridor, let's say, right? As far as very highly educated, well-paid sort of South Asian recruited labor, that is to say, as opposed to, let's say, taxi drivers, right? South Asian taxi drivers, deli owners. Those are two entirely different realities, right? Mm-hmm. So can there be one interpretation or misinterpretation? Absolutely not. But those are complicated, but we want the easy way in. And so maybe that's what you're getting at by the notion of misinterpretation, because it's easy to consume. The cabbie or the taxi driver, oh, the IT worker, then we have already a narrative in mind. And that's natural in a sense. But we also have to understand that those fantasies and narratives have a history with colonialism and US racialization and racial history of the way we relate to each other. We do see each other's race and gender immediately. So the notion of being colorblind is a bit disingenuous, right? Because we do see a narrative as soon as someone's race becomes apparent. Right? Mm-hmm. Then there's already, we're expecting a trajectory, a background that we already have in our heads. And if that person is racially ambiguous, we always assume and try to fish, what are you? Question, right? Which means, why is it important to know what I am? Well, it's because you want something fixed. You want a narrative because it fits into an expectation, right? And one of the examples that I tend to use in class is the "Where are you from?" question, which seems very innocent, right? And those questions are usually asked of Asian-faced peoples, right? It's not, and this is before we even open our mouths. And I don't mean to say people don't get that question. It's like, for example, if someone has some kind of British accent or a Caribbean accent, "Where are you from?" is referring to that accent, right? But the Asian face somehow elicits that. And of course, it's different when an Asian asks that from another Asian, because that's you're asking, what's the difference between us, is what you're asking if you're Asian to Asian question. But where are you from assumes, even if I were to say I'm from Jersey City, which I am, that's never going to be enough, right? Because the question really wants some fantasy figure somewhere in Asia. So Jersey City or New Jersey will not be enough. Where you're from is when are you really going back? Is there's implied in that question as well. So, but it is embedded in that history of border keeping, right? Mm-hmm. Which is different from racialization of Black bodies, where it was an order of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. But as opposed to the borders that define an ethno-national identity when it comes to Asian racialization, I think.
So how do you think the media in particular, or like reinforces these ideas? How do you feel like the media does that?
I think it's mostly across the board racialized figures become supporting actors, supporting the point of view, or it's always focalized within sort of a majority community, which is to say a presumed white audience. But however, I do want to say that there are examples like Fresh Off the Boat, or some other sort of, or the introduction of K-pop as a global phenomenon, right? And sort of or boba, or living in Central Jersey or New Jersey at all, the Asian presence is everywhere, of course. So I think there is something different regionally in the way that Asians are integrated into our lives in New Jersey and beyond.
How have media stereotypes within the last couple of years of Asian populations impacted the policy or attitude Americans have towards Asian Americans or Asian immigrants?
That's hard to determine, only because oftentimes Asian Americans or Asians living in the United States are affected very much by foreign policy. That's historically been true. With all the wars that have been prosecuted throughout Asia ever since the Philippine-American War in 1898, right? And then, of course, then you go to World War II against Japan. Then you go to the 1950s with the Korean conflict, and then the Vietnam War, and then the continuing and endless war in the Middle East, and which has produced Islamophobia and against the Muslim Americans, generally speaking, including South Asians and other folks who are of the Muslim faith, who share the Muslim faith. So, has it changed? It's hard because it's not just an internal change that has to happen, but a whole global change in a sense, right? Because one's life or one's body is read according to both the global political context. Right now, there's a conflict and tension with China, which continues, right? And which is one of the factors that worked with sort of the anti-Chinese sentiment, right? And this is very particular also whenever there's a bad economy. And this is true throughout American history. Whenever there's a bad economy, immigrants or people who look like immigrants become the target for why people are in a bad state. Not because of policies, not because of the way that corporations have run things, not because of the way sort of like the corporations as well as the politicians who created tax laws and other sort of wealth distribution very uneven. It's not because of them. It's because of people who are perceived to be immigrants that have caused the problem. So a couple of things, are always really shifting. And so that's why I was saying it's hard to determine, because of the political tensions with China right now. Of course, the continuing the continuing conflicts in the Middle East region, as well as the economic downturn that we're actually feeling right now in midterm elections, right? This becomes really important whenever people feel that they are suffering. The ethno-nationalism emerges, and therefore you need an outsider to actually blame the problems on. It couldn't be inside. It couldn't actually be my representative. It must be those others who are causing this problem of why I can't buy basic milk, bread, eggs, and cheese, and why the prices are so high. It must be them. It must be China. it must be undocumented immigrants, both Latinx and Asian. It must be the people who are on public entitlement, right?
Yeah.
So all those sort of factors of the others always emerge, right?
Yeah.
And that gets, and it reanimates the sort of racist tropes that we, in order to secure an ethno-national identity. Because it could not be what I'm doing wrong or my representatives are doing wrong. It must be what they are doing to me.
What do you think causes the misinterpretation of Native American minorities?
Well, for one, you have to look at the history of this country and the marginalization of Native American people from 1492 onwards. It's all been a project to eliminate indigenous people, to eliminate them from the face of the earth, to clear them from the land so that colonizers, settlers could take over and do whatever it is that they do, which is basically to create a white nation. And I think it's that invisibility of indigenous people, the fact that they were forced from their land, millions killed, even though they are still here. There are still indigenous folks here. They are rendered invisible. It's almost as if people just proceed with their daily lives pretending that Native people don't exist. And the proof of that, I think, is in the media images that we see. Traditionally in the Westerns, there was this image of the savages, of the inferior brutes with no civilization, and they were so astounded when the European settlers came with their technology, and this notion that people who have been here for thousands of years don't have any civilization.
When were those boarding schools implemented, and then how did those boarding schools harm Native American culture?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. So these schools, these residential schools, boarding schools, were set up in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it happened in Canada, happened in the US as well. So the government set these up, and so the government operated some of them, but then they also had churches that also operated these schools. And they, in the beginning, they expressed what the purpose was of these schools. The goal was to kill the Indian in the child. We can only imagine the amount of, now we should keep in mind also that they were tortured, brutalized, and killed in these government-run and religiously operated schools. So Canada, which still has a long way to go to deal with this issue, they're a lot further than we are, because they are actually acknowledging that it is an issue. It's the only way that you can really come to terms with such a devastating history. You have to acknowledge that it actually happened. Fortunately, we're at a time now where people don't even want you to learn about this history.
How do you think the boarding schools influenced the interpretation, the perception of Native American people?
I think that it gave the impression that these people have no civilization, no culture, so we're helping them. They're helpless. We're trying to give them a better way of life. Plays into this role of inferiority.
How do you think the media, America's relation with Native American and Indigenous peoples?
The stereotypes that continue in the media, stereotypes of Native Americans, helps to create an environment that allows for harsh policies against Indigenous people to continue.
Yeah.
If you view people as savages, as drunks, and violent, and people who really can't take care of themselves, and they're viewed as a threat to society, then I think you'll tend to have policies that really treat those people like dirt, just like the media images. I think that the media help to soften up the public so that they are conditioned to feel a certain way about people, even if it means that they haven't actually met any people from that group. They're conditioned through through the shows, through the programming, through the racist mascots.
What further steps do you think as a society we should take to make the media more representative?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things. And it seems that the people know that there's a problem. They've known for, over 50 years, but they don't want to deal with it. I believe that public funding of media, more of that is necessary. I also think that there have to be proactive efforts to allow more people of color in the decision-making positions in media, the writers, the editors, the people behind the camera, people who are doing the interviewing, people who are operating the cameras.
Yeah.
All of that. And then I also think that we have to have more people of color who are in positions where they can create, produce their own media products. And that includes independently. So making sure that they have the resources where they can actually go out and they don't have to worry about some large media conglomerate. People have known for years that this has been a problem. I think that sometimes people come up with solutions and they want to tweak at the edges a little bit, but ultimately we're going to have a fundamental change in this whole system.